What happens when a royal marriage becomes a prison? How does a queen navigate a world where her husband, the one person meant to be her partner, is her greatest adversary? What does a woman do when she has immense public power but no personal freedom? These are not just questions from stories. They were the realities for many women who wore a crown. They were promised a kingdom but were often handed a cage, gilded and admired from the outside, but cold and lonely within. Their lives were dictated by treaties, their happiness an afterthought to diplomacy. And for some, the king they were bound to was not a fairy tale prince, but a source of deep and lasting sorrow. Number 18, did she lead an army just to get away from him? Isabella of France was born a princess around 1295. Her father was King Philip IV of France, a powerful and ruthless ruler. Her marriage to Edward II of England was arranged when she was just a child. It was meant to be a peace treaty, a way to smooth over long-standing conflicts between England and France. She was beautiful, intelligent, and raised in a sophisticated court. At the age of 12, she was sent to England to marry a king she had never met. The problem started almost immediately. Edward II was not interested in his new wife. He was completely devoted to his close friend, Piers Gaveston. He gave Gaveston royal titles, lands, and even Isabella's own wedding jewels. At their coronation feast, Edward ignored Isabella and spent the entire time with Gaveston, who was dressed in royal purple, a color reserved for the king. It was a public humiliation for the young queen. The English nobles were outraged by the king's behavior and his favoritism. Isabella's own uncles, who had escorted her from France, were so offended they left in disgust. Isabella was patient at first. She was a teenager in a foreign land. She tried to make the marriage work. She wrote letters to her father in France complaining about her treatment, but also trying to build a relationship with Edward. For a few years, it seemed to work. Gaveston was exiled, and then, after he returned, was captured and killed by angry barons. For a time, Edward and Isabella seemed to find some common ground. She gave birth to a son and heir, the future Edward III, in 1312. This secured her position as queen and mother to a future king. But Edward's habits did not change. He soon found new favorites, a father and son duo named Hugh Despenser the Elder and Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers were even more greedy and controlling than Gaveston had been. They accumulated enormous wealth and power, isolating Edward from everyone else, including his own wife. They treated Isabella with contempt. They reduced her household staff, read her private mail, and dismissed her loyal servants. She was effectively a prisoner in her own court. The king did nothing to stop them. He was completely under their influence. Isabella endured this for years. She was a queen with no power, a wife with no husbandly affection, and a woman living under the thumb of her enemies. The breaking point came in 1325. A dispute over territory had broken out with France, now ruled by Isabella's brother, Charles IV. Isabella saw an opportunity. She convinced Edward and the Despensers to let her go to France to negotiate a peace treaty. It was a brilliant move. They saw it as a way to get rid of her for a while. She saw it as her only escape. Once in France, Isabella refused to return. She sent a message to Edward saying she would not come back to England until the Despensers were removed from power. She was no longer the powerless girl she had been. She had found her voice and her strength. In Paris, she gathered a following of exiled English nobles who also hated the Despensers. She also formed a close alliance with a powerful English baron, Roger Mortimer, who had escaped from the Tower of London. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer did the unthinkable. They raised a small army and invaded England. They landed with just a few hundred men, but the English people were so tired of Edward and the Despensers that they flocked to her side. The invasion was less of a war and more of a popular uprising. The king's support crumbled. The Despensers were captured and executed. Edward II was forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his son Edward III. Isabella, once the humiliated child bride, had returned as a conqueror. She had endured years of neglect and disrespect from a husband who cared more for his favorites than for his wife or his kingdom. She didn't just leave him, she overthrew him. She took control of her own destiny and changed the course of English history. Her story shows how a queen, pushed too far, could become a formidable power in her own right. Number 17 was her husband behind the scandal that nearly ruined her. Joan I of Navarre was a major figure in her time, but she's often a footnote in the story of her powerful husband, King Philip IV of France. Born around 1273, she was not just a queen consort. She was a queen in her own right. She inherited the Kingdom of Navarre and the County of Champagne from her father when she was an infant. This made her one of the most eligible heiresses in Europe. Her marriage to Philip in 1284 was a huge political prize for France. It brought the wealthy region of Champagne and the strategic Kingdom of Navarre under French control. Joan was described as intelligent, spirited, and capable. She took her duties as ruler of Navarre seriously. She even led an army herself to put down a revolt there. In France, she was a patron of the arts and learning. She founded the famous College of Navarre in Paris. By all accounts, she was a competent and respected ruler of her own lands. Her relationship with Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, is more complicated. On the surface, it seemed to be a successful royal partnership. They had 7 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood, including 3 future kings of France. This was a crucial success for any royal couple. Philip seemed to respect her administrative abilities and allowed her to govern her own territories of Navarre and Champagne. But Philip was a cold, calculating, and unemotional man. His reign was marked by his ruthless consolidation of power and his conflicts with the papacy and the Knights Templar. He was not a man known for warmth or affection. While there's no direct evidence of open hostility between them, the court was a place of political maneuvering. The worst part of Joan's story, and the part that reflects so poorly on her husband's court, is the notorious Tour de Nesle affair in 1314. It was a scandal that destroyed the reputations of her daughters-in-law. 2 of them, Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy, were accused of adultery. Her 3rd daughter-in-law, Joan of Burgundy, was accused of knowing about the affairs and keeping them secret. The accusations were made by Isabella, Joan's own daughter, the Queen of England. The 2 accused princesses were publicly humiliated. Their heads were shaved and they were imprisoned in fortresses. Margaret later died in prison, likely due to the harsh conditions. Blanche remained imprisoned for years. The scandal threw the royal succession into chaos. It cast doubt on the legitimacy of their children. Joan of Navarre died in 1305, 9 years before this scandal broke. But the affair reveals the kind of court environment she lived in. It was a place of intrigue and harsh judgment. Some historians have questioned Philip IV's role. Was he truly unaware of what was happening? Or did he use the scandal to get rid of daughters-in-law he disliked, or to exert control over his sons? We don't know for sure, but the court he presided over was not a safe or happy place for the royal women. The affair demonstrated a profound lack of respect and protection for the wives of his sons. For Joan, her marriage to Philip was a political success. It united territories and produced heirs, but she was married to one of the most rigid and unfeeling kings in French history. While he may have respected her as a ruler of Navarre, the environment he fostered in his own court led to the downfall and misery of the women in her family. Her legacy is tied to a man whose court was a cold and dangerous place, a fact that ultimately brought shame and instability to the dynasty she had helped to build. Number 16, can you be queen of an empire, but a prisoner in your own castle? Constance of Sicily was born in 1154, the daughter of the King of Sicily. She was the sole heir to the wealthy and powerful Norman kingdom, which included Sicily and southern Italy. For most of her life, it seemed unlikely she would ever rule. She didn't marry until she was 30, which was very late for a princess in that era. There were rumors she had become a nun, though this is likely just a legend. Her life changed dramatically when her nephew, the king, died without a clear heir. Suddenly, Constance was the key to the kingdom. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa saw his chance. He arranged for his son, Henry, to marry Constance. The marriage, which took place in 1186, was a massive political coup for Henry's family. It meant they could potentially unite the Holy Roman Empire, which covered Germany and northern Italy, with the Kingdom of Sicily in the south. The Norman nobles in Sicily were not happy about this. They feared German rule. Henry VI was a terrible husband for Constance. He was ambitious, power-hungry, and known for his cruelty. He saw Constance not as a wife or partner, but as a pawn in his game to conquer her kingdom. When the Sicilian nobles elected another man as their king, Henry invaded. His first attempt failed. During this campaign, Constance was captured by the Sicilians in the city of Salerno. They turned her over to her rival for the throne. She was a prisoner for, nearly a year, used as a bargaining chip. Eventually, the Pope intervened, and she was released and sent back to Henry in Germany. Imagine the humiliation, captured in your own kingdom and handed back to a husband who only valued you for your claim to that same kingdom. He showed her little personal affection. His entire focus was on military conquest and consolidating his power. A few years later, Henry successfully conquered Sicily. He was crowned king in 1194. He then began a brutal purge of the Sicilian nobles who had opposed him. He had men executed in horrific ways, a clear violation of the user's content guidelines. I will phrase this carefully. He established his rule through fear and eliminated his rivals without mercy. Constance was reportedly horrified by her husband's actions against her own people. She was the rightful queen, yet her husband was acting like a foreign conqueror. One of the most famous stories about Constance involves the birth of her son, the future Emperor Frederick II. Because she was 40 years old when she became pregnant, and because of her long time without children, rumors spread that the child was not really hers. To squash these rumors, Constance did something extraordinary. She had a tent set up in the public square of a town and gave birth in full view of several local women who could act as witnesses. It was a desperate act by a woman trying to secure her son's legacy against the backdrop of a difficult and politically charged marriage. Henry VI died in 1197 after a short and brutal reign. Constance, who had been sidelined by her husband, immediately took action. She moved to assert her own authority and that of her young son. She expelled many of the Germans Henry had installed in Sicily and sought the Pope's protection. She essentially undid much of her husband's work, trying to restore a sense of Sicilian independence. She spent the last year of her life securing the throne for her son, free from the shadow of the cruel man she had been forced to marry. Her life was a constant struggle to protect her inheritance and her people from the ambitions of her own husband. Number 15. What if your husband married other women while still married to you? Olympias, born around 375 BC, was a princess from Epirus, a region in ancient Greece. She was a fiery, intelligent, and deeply religious woman known for her devotion to mystic cults. She was not the kind of woman to sit quietly in the background. Her life became intertwined with history when she married King Philip II of Macedon in 357 BC. And Philip was a brilliant military commander and politician who was transforming Macedon from a backwater into the dominant power in Greece. Their marriage was a political alliance, but for a time, it seemed to be a strong partnership. Their son, born a year after the wedding, was Alexander the Great. Olympias was fiercely protective of Alexander and dedicated to ensuring he would inherit Philip's throne. She played a key role in his education, famously hiring the philosopher Aristotle to be his tutor, but Philip's court was not a place for a single, exclusive marriage. Macedonian kings traditionally practiced polygamy, marrying multiple wives to secure political alliances. Philip was no exception. Over the years, he took several other wives. For Olympias, who considered herself his principal wife and the mother of his chosen heir, this was a constant source of conflict and insecurity. She saw these other women and their potential children as threats to her son's future. The situation came to a head in 337 BC, and Philip, then in his mid-40s, decided to marry a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. This was different from his other marriages. Cleopatra was Macedonian, not a foreign princess. Her uncle, a powerful general named Attalus, made a toast at the wedding feast praying for a legitimate heir. This was a direct insult to Alexander, implying his legitimacy was questionable because his mother, Olympias, was from Epirus, not Macedon. Alexander was furious. He threw his cup at Attalus and a heated argument broke out with his father. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his son, but he was so unsteady that he tripped and fell. Alexander mocked him, saying, "Here is the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." After this public humiliation, Alexander and Olympias went into exile. Olympias returned to her homeland of Epirus, and Alexander went to Illyria. It was a complete breakdown of the family. Although father and son were eventually reconciled, the relationship with Olympias was shattered. She was effectively cast aside for a younger Macedonian wife. Her position and her son's felt more precarious than ever. A year later, in 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The circumstances were murky. Some ancient historians accused Olympias of being involved in the plot. There's no concrete evidence, but her motive was clear. With Philip gone, her son Alexander immediately became king. One of her first acts was to deal with her rival. Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant child were put to death, securing Alexander's throne from any potential challenge. This act, whether Alexander approved of it or not, cemented Olympias' reputation for being ruthless. Olympias' marriage was a constant battle. She had to contend with a husband who followed a tradition of multiple wives, which created endless rivalry and instability. He publicly humiliated her and her son, siding with the new wife's family. Her story is a dramatic example of a queen who was not a passive victim. She fought tooth and nail for her own power, and most importantly, for the supremacy of her son, in a court environment that was designed to keep her off balance. Number 14, would you forgive a husband who was forced on you for political reasons? Isabella II of Spain had a truly unfortunate start to her reign. She became queen in 1833 when she was just 3 years old. Her childhood and adolescence were dominated by political instability and interference from powerful generals and politicians. When it came time for her to marry, it was not a personal choice. It was a major international issue known as the Affair of the Spanish Marriages. France and Great Britain both wanted to influence the choice of husband to gain an advantage. After much diplomatic wrangling, the choice fell on Isabella's first cousin, Francis, Duke of Cadiz. It was a disastrous decision made entirely for political reasons. Isabella, who was a high-spirited and strong-willed teenager, was firmly against the match. She found Francis to be unappealing and not at all the kind of man she wanted for a husband. She reportedly complained bitterly about the choice, but she had no power to refuse. The government insisted. They were married in 1846 when Isabella was 16. The wedding night was, by her own account, a disaster. She was deeply unhappy with her new husband. From that point on, their marriage was a marriage in name only. They lived largely separate lives within the royal palace. They were completely incompatible. Francis was quiet and devout, while Isabella was sociable and enjoyed parties and military parades. Their relationship was cold and distant. They were polite to each other in public for the sake of appearances, but there was no affection between them. The primary duty of a royal couple was to produce heirs, and this presented a problem. Despite their personal animosity, they did have 12 children, though only 5 survived to adulthood. However, the paternity of her children was the subject of constant gossip and speculation. It was widely rumored that Francis was not the father of most, if not all, of them. Isabella was known to have a series of lovers, and many believed her children were the result of these relationships. Francis, for his part, seemed to accept the situation. He did not publicly challenge the legitimacy of the children. He continued to perform his duties as king consort, but he had no real power or influence. The marriage was a sham, a political arrangement that resulted in personal misery for both of them, but especially for Isabella, who had been forced into it. This dysfunctional marriage had political consequences. The constant rumors about the queen's personal life damaged the reputation of the monarchy. It provided ammunition for her political enemies. Her reign was plagued by instability, military coups, and political turmoil. Her unhappy marriage was just one more factor that weakened her position. In 1868, A revolution known as the Glorious Revolution forced Isabella to flee Spain and go into exile in Paris. Francis went with her, but they soon separated for good. She formally abdicated the throne in 1870 in favor of her son Alfonso XII. Isabella II was a queen who was denied the basic right to choose her own partner. Her husband was selected to solve a political problem with no regard for her personal happiness. The result was a loveless, empty marriage that became a public scandal. She was trapped in a relationship she never wanted, and she sought comfort and companionship outside of it. It's a sad story of a woman whose personal life was sacrificed for reasons of state, leaving her with a husband who was a constant, unwelcome presence in her life. Number 13, how do you survive when your husband throws you out for being too old-fashioned? Eudoxia Lopukina was chosen to be the wife of Peter the Great of Russia in 1689. She came from a respectable but not particularly powerful boyar noble family. The marriage was arranged by Peter's mother. Eudoxia was 19, raised in a traditional, devoutly religious household. She embodied the old-fashioned Muscovite values that had governed Russia for centuries. Peter, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was a force of nature obsessed with Western Europe. He was fascinated by ships, technology, and modern military tactics. He wanted to drag Russia, kicking and screaming, out of its medieval past and into the modern world. He saw Eudoxia and her traditional family as symbols of everything he wanted to change. The marriage was a mismatch from the very beginning, but Peter found his wife boring. He was energetic and curious. She was quiet and conservative. He spent his time with his foreign friends in the German quarter of Moscow, learning about shipbuilding and holding wild parties. Eudoxia was left behind in the Kremlin, surrounded by her traditionalist relatives. Peter quickly grew to despise her and everything she represented. He was openly cruel to her. He ignored her for long periods, preferring the company of his mistresses. His longest and most famous affair was with a German woman named Anna Mons. He made no secret of this relationship, which was a deep humiliation for Eudoxia. She gave birth to 3 sons, but only the eldest, Alexei, survived infancy. Even the birth of an heir did not improve her standing with her husband. After about a decade of this unhappy marriage, Peter decided he was done with her. In 1698, after returning from his grand embassy tour of Western Europe, he was more determined than ever to modernize Russia. He decided to get rid of his old-fashioned wife. He tried to convince her to enter a convent voluntarily. This was a common way for powerful Russian men to discard unwanted wives. Eudoxia refused. She loved her son and did not want to be separated from him. Peter was furious. He had her taken by force and confined to the Intercession Convent in Suzdal. She was forced to become a nun against her will. Her name was effectively erased. She was no longer the Serena, but Eudoxia's story didn't end there. In the convent, she was treated with some respect by the local clergy and was allowed to live more like a laywoman than a nun. A few years later, she began a relationship with an army officer. For a brief time, she found some personal happiness. This came to a disastrous end. Her son, Tsarevich Alexei, had a terrible relationship with his father, Peter. Alexei eventually fled Russia, but was lured back with promises of forgiveness. Peter then launched a brutal investigation into everyone who had supported Alexei. Eudoxia's affair was discovered. Her lover was executed. The nuns and clergy who had helped her were punished. Eudoxia herself was publicly shamed and transferred to a stricter convent where she was kept in harsh conditions for years. She was only released after Peter the Great's death. Her grandson, Peter II, brought her back to Moscow and restored her to a position of honor. But she had spent nearly 30 years as a prisoner, all because her husband found her incompatible with his grand ambitions. She was a victim of his ruthless drive to change Russia, a personal casualty of his war against the old ways. Number 12, how did she seize an empire from a husband who acted like a child? Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst was a minor German princess born in 1729. Her life changed forever when she was chosen to marry the heir to the Russian throne, the future Peter III. She was brought to Russia, converted to the Orthodox faith, and given a new name, Catherine. This marriage was purely political, orchestrated by Empress Elizabeth of Russia. From the moment she arrived, Catherine dedicated herself to becoming Russian. She learned the language so diligently that she reportedly got pneumonia from studying at night in the cold. She embraced the Orthodox faith. She worked hard to win the favor of the Empress and the Russian people. Her husband, Peter, did the exact opposite. He was immature and boorish. He openly detested Russia, its people, its religion, and its customs. He much preferred his native Holstein and the culture of Prussia. He spent his days playing with toy soldiers, arranging elaborate military drills for his servants, and drinking heavily. He was cruel to Catherine, flaunting his mistresses and often humiliating her in public. He was childish and erratic. One story claims he held a court-martial for a rat that had chewed one of his toy soldiers and then had the rat executed. Their marriage was a miserable failure. They lived separate lives in the palace. Catherine, realizing her husband was unfit to rule and that her own position was precarious, began to cultivate her own allies. She was intelligent, charming, and politically savvy. She read widely, corresponding with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire. She built a network of powerful supporters in the military and at court, including her lover, Grigory Orlov. In 1762, Empress Elizabeth died and Peter became emperor. His reign was a disaster that lasted only 6 months. He immediately made a series of wildly unpopular decisions. He withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, giving up significant military gains and forming an alliance with Russia's recent enemy, Prussia, a country he greatly admired. He alienated the powerful imperial guard by trying to force them to wear Prussian-style uniforms. He also threatened the Orthodox Church by seizing its lands. He made it clear that he intended to divorce Catherine, possibly imprisoning her, or worse, and marry his mistress. Catherine knew she had to act to save herself. With the help of the Orlov brothers and other supporters in the guard, she staged a coup. In June 1762, while Peter was away from the capital, Catherine went to the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment, who immediately swore allegiance to her. Other regiments followed. The church and the government proclaimed her the sole ruler of Russia. It was a swift and bloodless takeover. Peter was arrested and forced to abdicate. A few days later, he was killed under mysterious circumstances, likely by his guards. Catherine, the German princess who had been brought to Russia to be a consort, had outmaneuvered her husband and seized the throne for herself. She went on to rule Russia for 34 years in a period that became known as the Russian Golden Age. She expanded the empire, promoted the arts and sciences, and became one of the most famous and successful rulers in history, known forever as Catherine the Great. She was married to a man who was completely unsuited to be emperor, a man who disdained her and the country he was meant to rule. She didn't just survive him, she replaced him. Number 11 was her husband's inaction the worst kind of cruelty? Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess, was married to the future Louis XVI of France in 1770. She was 14, he was 15. The marriage was a political alliance designed to seal a new friendship between the rival powers of Austria and France. Marie Antoinette was lively, sociable, and used to the relatively relaxed Austrian court. Louis was shy, awkward, and serious. He preferred solitary hobbies like hunting and locksmithing. They were a complete mismatch in personality. From the beginning, their marriage was difficult. It was famously not consummated for 7 years. This was a huge problem for a royal couple. Their primary job was to produce an heir, and their failure to do so became a matter of public gossip and political concern. It was a source of great anxiety and humiliation for both of them, but especially for Marie Antoinette. The pressure on her was immense. Louis was not a cruel man in a malicious way. He was not abusive or unfaithful. In fact, he was devoted to her. But his weakness and indecisiveness made him a terrible husband for a queen in such a high-pressure environment. He was unable to offer her the emotional support or political guidance she desperately needed. He was a kind man, but an ineffective king and an inadequate partner. Left to her own devices in the formal and stifling court of Versailles, Marie Antoinette created her own social circle. She threw lavish parties, gambled, and spent enormous sums on fashion and jewelry. She built a fantasy retreat, the Petit Trianon, where she could escape the pressures of court life. This behavior, while understandable for a young woman in her position, was politically disastrous. She was seen as frivolous, extravagant, and out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. Vicious pamphlets and libels circulated accusing her of all sorts of immoral behavior. They called her Madame Deficit. Louis did little to defend her or to curb her spending. He seemed incapable of controlling her or the court. His inaction allowed her reputation to be destroyed. He loved her, but he could not protect her from her own political missteps or from her enemies. As the French Revolution began to unfold, Louis's indecisiveness became fatal. He repeatedly failed to make firm decisions. He would agree to reforms one day and then go back on his word the next, influenced by conservative courtiers. Marie Antoinette, who was more strong-willed, urged him to take a firm stand against the revolutionaries, but her advice was often wrong and made the situation worse. They were politically inept, a couple completely unprepared for the crisis that engulfed them. Their famous attempt to flee France in 1791, the flight to Varennes, was a poorly planned disaster that sealed their fate. It proved to the people that the king and queen could not be trusted. They became prisoners of the revolution. Throughout their ordeal, they grew closer. The shy king and the frivolous queen found comfort and strength in each other and their children. In their final days, they showed great dignity, but it was too little, too late. Louis's inability to lead, to make decisions, and to understand the political reality of his country contributed directly to their downfall. His was not a marriage of overt cruelty, but one of devastating incompetence and neglect. His failure as a king meant he was also a failure as a husband, unable to protect his wife and family from the storm that he himself had helped to create. Number 10, can a queen be a child, bride twice, over? Isabella of Valois has one of the most unusual and sad stories of any English queen. She was the daughter of King Charles VI of France. In 1396, she was married to King Richard II of England. She was 6 years old at the time. Richard was 29. This marriage was not meant to be a real partnership, of course. It was a political move. Richard II wanted a long-term truce with France, and this marriage was intended to secure it. A 20-year-old French princess had been considered, but Richard chose the child Isabella instead. He seemed to treat her with kindness and respect. He visited her often, sent her gifts, and their relationship was described as a sort of affectionate friendship between an adult and a child. He was waiting for her to grow up. For Isabella, it must have been a strange life. She was a queen in a foreign country, with her own household and ladies in waiting, but she was still a child. Her French attendants made sure she was not lonely. She was being prepared for a future role as Richard's wife and queen consort. But that future never came. In 1399, just 3 years after the wedding, Richard II's reign collapsed. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile, raised an army, and deposed Richard. Richard was captured and imprisoned. Henry became King Henry IV. Suddenly, the 9-year-old Queen Isabella was in a very dangerous position. She was the wife of the deposed king, a living symbol of the old regime. Henry IV at first treated her well, moving her out of Windsor Castle for her own safety. He then had an idea. He wanted Isabella to marry his own son and heir, the future King Henry V. This would transfer the legitimacy of her marriage to his own new dynasty and keep the French alliance intact. Isabella, now a widow at the age of 10 after Richard's death in captivity, showed incredible strength of character. She flatly refused. She went into mourning for her husband Richard, and would not consider marrying the son of the man who had overthrown him. She resisted all of Henry Thorne's attempts to persuade her. For a child, it was a remarkable act of loyalty and defiance. Her refusal put Henry IV in a difficult position. He couldn't keep her in England forever. Her family in France was demanding her return, along with her dowry. After long negotiations, Isabella was finally allowed to return to France In 1401, she had been Queen of England for 5 years, but her marriage had never been a real one, and her reign had ended in tragedy and political upheaval. Her story wasn't over. In 1406, at the age of 16, she married again, this time to her cousin, Charles, Duke of Orleans. This seems to have been a much happier match. They had a daughter together, but tragically, Isabella died in 1409 at the age of 19, following the birth of her child. Her life was defined by two political marriages. The first, to Richard II, made her a queen at an age when she should have been playing with dolls. It ended with her husband's overthrow and death, leaving her a child widow in a hostile country. Her second marriage brought her some happiness, but it was cut short. She was a pawn in the games of kings, her personal life dictated entirely by the needs of diplomacy and war. Number 9. What if both of your husbands were terrible in different ways? Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. Born around 1122, she inherited the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France in her own right. This made her the most desirable bride in Europe. In 1137, at the age of 15, she married the heir to the French throne, who became King Louis VII just a few weeks later. The marriage was a disaster. Eleanor was vibrant, educated, and worldly, raised in the sophisticated and cultured court of Aquitaine. Louis was a pious, monastic man who had been destined for a life in the church before his older brother's death made him king. He was quiet and reserved. She was outgoing and assertive. Their personalities clashed completely. He was reportedly shocked by her worldliness. Their biggest problem was their failure to produce a male heir. In 15 years of marriage, they had only 2 daughters. This was a critical failure for a royal dynasty. The breaking point came during the Second Crusade. Eleanor insisted on accompanying her husband, bringing along her own vassals from Aquitaine. The journey was filled with tension. In Antioch, she spent time with her uncle Raymond, a dashing and charming ruler. Rumors of an affair spread, though it's more likely their close relationship was just a source of political disagreement with Louis. The rumors, however, damaged the marriage beyond repair. Louis felt humiliated, the crusade itself was a military failure, and they returned to France barely speaking. Eleanor wanted out. She argued that they were too closely related by blood for the marriage to be valid. In 1152, after 15 years together, their marriage was annulled. It was a shocking event for the time. Eleanor immediately took control of her own destiny. Just 8 weeks later, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was 11 years younger than her and was set to become King of England. This marriage was the opposite of her first one, where Louis was meek, Henry was energetic, ambitious, and ruthless. In 1154, he became King Henry II of England. Together, they ruled over a vast territory, the Angevin Empire, which stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. At first, the marriage was a passionate and successful partnership. They had 8 children together, including 5 sons. This secured the succession in a way she never could with Louis. Eleanor was an active political partner, ruling as regent in England when Henry was away and managing her own lands in Aquitaine. But Henry II was a difficult man. He had a ferocious temper and was famously unfaithful. His most famous affair was with Rosamund Clifford, but there were many others. As their sons grew up, the marriage began to fall apart. Eleanor supported her sons in their rebellions against their father. She felt Henry was not giving them enough power or land. In 1173, she backed a major revolt by 3 of her sons. The revolt failed. Henry was furious with his wife's betrayal. His solution was drastic. He had Eleanor captured and imprisoned her. For the next 16 years, she was held under house arrest in various castles in England. The powerful queen who had ruled over vast lands was now a political prisoner, confined by her own husband. She was only released in 1189 after Henry II died, and her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. She immediately returned to a position of power, ruling as regent while Richard was on the Third Crusade. She even helped raise the enormous ransom to free him when he was captured on his way home. Eleanor's 2 marriages were to 2 of the most powerful kings in Europe. The first husband was too weak and pious for her. The second was too strong and tyrannical. She found personal and political fulfillment with neither. Her story is one of a woman constantly fighting for power and autonomy against the limitations imposed on her by her husbands. Number 8, was she truly mad or just driven there by a cruel husband? Joanna of Castile, known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, has one of history's most tragic stories. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of the famous Queen Isabella the First of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the monarchs who unified Spain and sponsored Christopher Columbus. Joanna was highly intelligent, well-educated, and known for her passionate nature. In 1496, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip, Duke of Burgundy, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The marriage was a political alliance aimed at encircling Spain's rival France. When Joanna and Philip met, they were instantly and passionately in love. This was rare for a royal arranged marriage, but this passionate love would soon curdle into a destructive obsession for Joanna. Philip, nicknamed the Handsome, was charming but also arrogant, selfish, and notoriously unfaithful. Joanna was deeply in love with him, and his constant philandering caused her immense emotional distress. She became intensely jealous and possessive. There were public scenes and confrontations. Her behavior was seen as unstable and shocking for a queen. The situation worsened as Joanna's status changed. A series of deaths in her family, her brother, her older sister, and her nephew Energy unexpectedly left her as the heir to the crowns of Castile and Aragon. Suddenly, this emotionally volatile woman was in line to rule a vast empire. Her husband Philip saw this as his opportunity. He wanted to rule Spain himself and began to scheme to have Joanna declared incompetent. He started spreading rumors that she was mentally unstable. In 1504, Joanna's mother, Queen Isabella III, died, and Joanna became Queen of Castile. She and Philip traveled to Spain to claim her throne. Philip immediately began to clash with Joanna's father, Ferdinand, over who should control the government. Both men wanted to sideline Joanna. They used her emotional outbursts as proof of her incapacity to rule. Then, in 1506, Philip suddenly died of a fever. Joanna was completely devastated. Her grief was extreme. She refused to be separated from his body. She traveled with his coffin for months across the Spanish countryside, reportedly opening it periodically to look at her husband. This macabre journey cemented her reputation for madness. Whether Joanna was truly clinically insane or simply suffering from profound grief and depression is still debated by historians. But her father, Ferdinand, saw his chance. He took control of Castile, claiming to be acting as regent for his mad daughter. He had Joanna confined to a castle convent in Tordesillas. She remained a prisoner there for the rest of her life. She was the rightful queen of Spain, but she held no power. After her father's death, her own son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, came to Spain to claim his inheritance. He met with his mother but made no move to free her. He continued her confinement, using her name to legitimize his own rule but keeping her locked away. Joanna of Castile spent 46 years as a prisoner in Tordesillas from 1509 until her death in 1555. Her life was destroyed by the men who were supposed to care for her. Her husband, Philip, was unfaithful and used her emotional state to try and usurp her power. Her father and her son then used that same reputation for madness to imprison her and rule in her name. She was a queen only in title, her life a long and lonely tragedy. Number 7, how do you survive a husband who is dangerously unstable? Caroline Mathilde was a British princess, the sister of King George III. In 1766, at the age of 15, she was sent to Denmark to marry her cousin, King Christian VII. It was a typical arranged royal marriage, but it turned into a nightmare. Christian VII was, to put it mildly, not well. He suffered from a severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia. He was erratic, prone to violent outbursts, and completely incapable of governing his country. He would have paranoid delusions and wander the streets of Copenhagen at night, getting into brawls. His behavior was a terrifying and unpredictable ordeal for his young wife. He neglected Caroline Mathilde from the start. He was cold and dismissive towards her. Their marriage was a sham, although they did manage to have a son, the future King Frederick VI. But Christian continued his bizarre and debauched lifestyle, leaving his wife isolated and miserable in a foreign court. The Danish court was controlled by conservative nobles who had little time for the young queen. She had no friends and no allies. Her life changed dramatically with the arrival of Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor who was brought in to treat the king. Struensee was a man of the Enlightenment. He was intelligent, ambitious, and charismatic. He managed to gain a remarkable degree of influence over the unstable king. Christian came to depend on him completely. As Struensee's power grew, he became the de facto ruler of Denmark. He began to implement a series of radical reforms inspired by Enlightenment ideals, touching everything from the abolition of censorship to reorganizing the government. During this time, Caroline Mathilde, who shared Struensee's progressive views, found in him a kindred spirit. They fell in love and began a passionate affair. For a brief period, Caroline Mathilde was happy. She was no longer isolated. She had a partner she respected and loved, and together they were trying to modernize Denmark, with the king as a mere figurehead. She gave birth to a daughter, Princess Louise Augusta, who was widely accepted to be Struensee's child. But their time in power was short-lived. Their rapid reforms and their scandalous affair angered the powerful conservative establishment, including the king's stepmother, Dowager Queen Juliana Maria. In January 1772, they staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, charged with usurping royal authority, and executed. Caroline Mathilde was also arrested and confessed to the affair. She was divorced from the king and exiled. She was sent to live in Celle, a town in her brother's German territory of Hanover. She was never allowed to see her children again. She died just 3 years later from an illness at the age of 23. Her life was a tragedy. She was married as a teenager to a man with a severe mental illness who made her life a misery. She found a brief period of happiness and purpose, only to have it brutally torn away from her. Her husband's condition not only made her personal life unbearable, but also created the political vacuum that allowed for her and her lover's rise and dramatic fall. Number 6, can a husband lock you away for 30 years? Sophie Dorothea of Celle was born in 1666, the daughter of a German duke. Her marriage was a purely dynastic arrangement designed to unite the territories of Celle and Hanover. In 1682, she was married to her cousin, George Louis of Hanover. It was a terrible match. Sophie Dorothea was young and vivacious. George was dull, cold, and rigid. He was a soldier, more comfortable on the battlefield than in a drawing room. He made it clear from the start that he did not care for his wife. He married her for her inheritance, not for love. He was also openly unfaithful. He had a long-term mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg, with whom he had several children. He installed her at court and spent most of his time with her, which was a constant humiliation for his wife. Sophie Dorothea was trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who ignored her and flaunted his infidelity. She gave birth to 2 children, a son, the future King George II of Great Britain, and a daughter, the future Queen of Prussia. But this did little to improve her situation. She was lonely and desperate for affection. She found it with a Swedish count and soldier of fortune named Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. Königsmarck was handsome, charming, an adventurous X-Men, everything her husband was not. They began a passionate, secret correspondence, and it's believed they became lovers. They planned to run away together to escape the stifling court of Hanover. In July 1694, their plans came to a disastrous end. Königsmarck visited the palace for a late-night rendezvous with Sophie Dorothea. He was never seen again. He was almost certainly ambushed and killed within the palace walls, on the orders of either George's father, the Elector, or George himself. His body was disposed of, possibly weighted down, and thrown into a river. With her lover gone, Sophie Dorothea's fate was sealed. George divorced her on grounds of abandonment. But that was not the end of her punishment. She was declared a prisoner. She was sent to the castle of Halden, a remote manor house, and there she stayed for the rest of her life. She was a prisoner for over 30 years. She was not allowed to remarry. She was not allowed to see her own children ever again. Her name was removed from official documents. She was known as the Princess of Halden. Her husband George refused to even hear her name spoken in his presence. In 1714, her life took another strange turn. Her husband, through a series of dynastic accidents, became King George I of Great Britain. While he moved to London to rule a new kingdom, his divorced wife remained a prisoner back in Germany. The new King of Great Britain had a wife he kept locked in a castle. Sophie Dorothea died in 1726, still a prisoner. She had spent more than half her life in confinement. Her crime was seeking happiness outside a cold, politically motivated marriage. Her husband's response was not just to end the marriage, but to erase her from existence, locking her away for decades in one of the most cruel and prolonged punishments ever inflicted on a royal spouse. Number 5, can you loathe someone so much you bar them from their own coronation? Caroline of Brunswick and her husband, the future George IV of the United Kingdom, had one of the most spectacularly awful royal marriages in history. It was a relationship built on mutual hatred from the moment they first met. Caroline was a German princess chosen to marry George, the Prince of Wales, in 1795. George agreed to the marriage for one reason. Only Parliament had promised to pay off his enormous debts if he married a suitable princess. He was already secretly and illegally married to a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, whom he loved. When Caroline arrived in England, their first meeting was a disaster. George took one look at her, turned to his attendant, and said, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He found her loud, unrefined, and unattractive. She, in turn, found him fat and not nearly as handsome as his portrait suggested. He was reportedly so drunk on their wedding night that he passed out in the fireplace. The marriage was over almost as soon as it began. They had one child together, Princess Charlotte, born 9 months after the wedding. After her birth, they separated and lived apart for the rest of their lives. George wrote in a letter that they would never share a bed again. Caroline was determined to live her own life. She set up her own rival court and was known for her flamboyant and often undignified behavior. She was excluded from the main royal court, and her access to her own daughter Charlotte was severely restricted, which was a source of great pain for her. Fed up with her life in England, Caroline went abroad in 1814. She traveled around Europe and the Mediterranean with a large and eccentric entourage. Her behavior became even more scandalous. She hired an Italian man named Bartolomeo Pergami as her servant and quickly promoted him, making him her constant companion. Rumors flew that they were lovers. In 1820, her father-in-law, King George III, died, and her estranged husband became King George IV. Caroline was now, by law, the Queen of the United Kingdom. She decided to return to England to claim her rights. George IV was horrified. He was determined to prevent her from being crowned queen. He instigated a government bill in the House of Lords to divorce her and strip her of her title. This led to a sensational public trial, the Pains and Penalties Bill 1820. The government presented witnesses who gave lurid testimony about Caroline's behavior with Pergami. The public, however, largely sided with Caroline. They saw her as a victim of a cruel and decadent king. She became a symbol of popular opposition to the monarchy. The trial became so unpopular that the government was forced to withdraw the bill. And Caroline had won a major public victory, but the king was not finished. On the day of his coronation in July 1821, he gave explicit orders that she was not to be allowed into Westminster Abbey. Caroline went anyway. She arrived in a carriage and tried to enter through several doors, but at each one she was turned away by armed guards. The doors were literally slammed in her face. It was the ultimate public humiliation. The rightful queen of the United Kingdom was physically barred from her own coronation. Heartbroken and defeated, she fell ill shortly after. She died just 3 weeks later. Her marriage was a toxic disaster from start to finish. Her husband didn't just neglect her, he actively and publicly persecuted her, using the full power of the state to try and destroy her reputation and deny her status. Number 4, how do you react when your husband calls you a horse? Anne of Cleves was the 4th wife of King Henry V of England. Her story is often remembered as a lucky escape, but her brief marriage was a deeply humiliating and frightening experience. In 1539, Henry V had been a widower for 2 years after the death of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was eager for Henry to remarry to secure a Protestant alliance in Europe. The Duchy of Cleves, a state in what is now Germany, seemed like a good choice. Cromwell dispatched the court painter Hans Holbein the Younger to paint portraits of the Duke of Cleves' two unmarried sisters, Anne and Amalia. Henry saw Holbein's portrait of Anne and was pleased. He agreed to the marriage contract without ever having met her. Anne of Cleves then began the long journey to England. She had been raised in a small, sheltered court and spoke no English. She was not trained in music or the sophisticated arts of conversation that were common in the English court. Henry, eager to see his new bride, decided to surprise her. He rode in disguise to Rochester, where she was staying. He burst into her room, expecting her to recognize him through the power of love, like a character in a courtly romance. Anne, who had never seen him before and was just watching a bear baiting from the window, was confused and alarmed. She barely gave him a second glance. Henry was deeply offended by her reaction. He was also profoundly disappointed by her appearance. He complained to his ministers that she was not as beautiful as her portrait. He famously declared, "I like her not. I like her not." He complained about her looks and her manners. The most famous insult attributed to him, though it might be an exaggeration, was that she looked like a Flanders mare. He felt trapped. The marriage treaty was signed. The alliance was politically important. He had to go through with the wedding in January 1540. But he was determined to get out of it. He immediately began searching for a way to annul the marriage. He claimed it had never been consummated. He also used the excuse that Anne had a pre-contract of marriage to another European noble, even though that had been formally broken years earlier. For Anne, this must have been a terrifying time. She was in a foreign country, unable to speak the language, and her powerful and notoriously ruthless husband clearly despised her. She had seen what happened to Henry's previous wives. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside and died in isolation. Anne Boleyn was executed, but Anne of Cleves was intelligent and pragmatic. When she was approached with the plan for an annulment, she did not fight it. She agreed to everything. She testified that the marriage had not been consummated and agreed to the annulment. This smart move probably saved her life. Henry was so relieved by her cooperation that he treated her with remarkable generosity. The marriage was annulled after just 6 months. Anne was given a generous settlement, including several properties, including Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn's family. She was given the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. She remained in England and became a welcome, if occasional, guest at court. She outlived Henry and all his other wives, dying peacefully in 1557. While she ended up with a good life, the initial experience was a nightmare. She was rejected, insulted, and publicly humiliated by one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Europe. Her cleverness and calm demeanor turned a potentially fatal situation into a comfortable retirement. Number 3, was she executed for being a teenager? Catherine Howard was the 5th wife of King Henry V. Her story is one of the most tragic of all the Tudor queens. She was a young noblewoman, a cousin to Anne Boleyn, and came to court as a lady in waiting to Henry's 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. And Henry, now in his late 40s, overweight, and suffering from a painful leg ulcer, was completely infatuated with the vibrant, pretty, and cheerful teenager. He saw her as his rose without a thorn. Shortly after annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, he married Catherine. She was likely no older than 19. He was 49. Henry doted on his young wife. He showered her with gifts, jewels, and fine clothes. For a brief time, Catherine seemed to enjoy her new role as queen, but she was dangerously unprepared for it. She was a young girl who liked to have fun, not a shrewd political player. She had a past, and she brought that past with her to court. Before she ever met the king, Catherine had been involved in relationships with other men. While living in the household of her step-grandmother, she had a relationship with her music teacher, Henry Mannix. Later, she had a more serious relationship with a gentleman named Francis Derham. These were not just youthful flirtations, they were serious indiscretions for a woman of her time and station. When she became queen, she made the fatal mistake of appointing people from her past to positions in her household. She made Francis Derham her private secretary. She also began a reckless and foolish flirtation with one of the king's favorite courtiers, a man named Thomas Culpeper. She started meeting him for secret late-night rendezvous, aided by her lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother. It was only a matter of time before her past caught up with her. In 1541, a man who knew of her previous relationship with Dereham reported it to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer launched an investigation. He uncovered the stories about Mannix and Dereham. Then, under questioning, they found evidence of the secret meetings with Culpeper. When Henry was told, he was at first in disbelief. He adored his young queen. But as the evidence mounted, his infatuation turned to furious betrayal. He felt like an old fool who had been made a mockery of by his young wife. Dereham and Culpeper were arrested. Catherine's household was dismissed, and she was confined to her rooms. Under interrogation, Catherine's story came out. She admitted to her past with Dereham, but insisted it was before her marriage to the king. She confessed to her meetings with Culpeper, but denied they had a physical relationship, though a letter she wrote to him suggested otherwise. It didn't matter. The king's pride was wounded, and he wanted revenge. Dereham was executed. Culpeper was also executed. A bill of attainder was passed against Catherine, a legal process that declared her guilty of treason without a formal trial. In February 1442, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London. She was just a girl, probably no more than 21 years old, who had been thrust into a world she didn't understand. Her youthful indiscretions and her reckless behavior as queen cost her everything. She was executed, a victim of her own immaturity and the wounded pride of a tyrannical old king. Number 2, did she suffer the most of all his wives? Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess, the daughter of the formidable monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. She was betrothed to the English heir, Prince Arthur, from a young age. She arrived in England in 1501 to marry him, a key piece in a major political alliance. But just a few months after their wedding, Arthur died. This left the teenage Catherine in a precarious position. She was a widow in a foreign land. Her future was uncertain. For 7 long years, she lived in a state of diplomatic limbo. Her father and her father-in-law, King Henry VII, argued over her dowry and her future. At times, she lived in poverty, unable to pay her own servants. Finally, after Henry VII's death, his younger son, the new King Henry V, made a decision. In 1509, he married Catherine. He was 18, she was 23. For nearly 2 decades, they had what appeared to be a successful and loving marriage. Henry trusted her completely. When he was away at war in France, he made her regent of England, and she oversaw a major English victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. But their marriage was marked by one overwhelming tragedy: their failure to produce a male heir. Catherine endured a series of heartbreaking pregnancies. She had at least 6, but only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. For Henry, who was obsessed with securing the Tudor dynasty, this was a catastrophe. By the mid-1520s, Henry was in his 30s, and Catherine was in her 40s. It was clear she would have no more children. At the same time, Henry had fallen deeply in love with a charismatic young woman at court, Anne Boleyn. Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God. He based this on a passage in the Bible that said a man should not marry his brother's widow. He argued that because Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur, their own marriage was invalid. He became determined to get an annulment from the Pope. Catherine was a woman of immense piety and integrity. She fought back with everything she had. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and that therefore her marriage to Henry was perfectly valid. She refused to go quietly into a nunnery. She was Henry's true and lawful wife, and she would not accept any other title. This began a long and agonizing struggle that became known as the King's Great Matter. It dragged on for years. The Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment. And Henry's love for Anne Boleyn and his desire for an heir drove him to a radical solution. He broke with the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and had his own archbishop grant him the annulment. In 1533, he married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was cast aside. She was stripped of her title as queen and forced to live in a series of remote, damp castles. She was separated from her daughter Mary, whom she was never allowed to see again. Her health failed. She died in 1536, still insisting in her final letter to Henry that she was his one true wife. Her last years were a testament to her incredible strength and unwavering belief in the rightness of her cause. She was rejected, humiliated, and isolated by the husband she had loved and served faithfully for over 20 years. Number 1. What happens when your husband thinks you stand in his way? Anne Boleyn is perhaps the most famous of Henry V's wives. Her story is a dramatic rise and a terrifying fall. She was not a princess, but an English noblewoman who had spent time in the sophisticated courts of Europe. She returned to England in the early 1520s, a captivating woman known for her style, intelligence, and sharp wit. She caught the eye of King Henry V, who had grown tired of his wife, Catherine of Aragon. At first, Henry wanted Anne to be his mistress, but Anne refused. She would not be a royal mistress, she would be queen, or nothing. This refusal was a brilliant and risky move. It only made Henry more determined to have her. Her ambition and Henry's obsession led to a revolution. For 7 years, they waited while Henry tried to get his marriage to Catherine annulled. Anne was in a difficult position. She was the other woman disliked by the English people who loved Queen Catherine. But she held firm, and her influence over the king grew. She was a key supporter of the religious reformers who wanted to break from Rome. Finally, in 1533, Henry took the final step. He broke with the Pope, had his marriage to Catherine declared void, and secretly married the now pregnant Anne. She was crowned Queen of England. She had won, she had achieved her goal, but being queen was not what she had imagined. Her primary duty was to give Henry the son he so desperately wanted. In September 1533, she gave birth, but it was to a girl, the future Queen Elizabeth. $1,000 was a bitter disappointment for Henry. Anne had subsequent pregnancies, but they ended in miscarriages. Henry's passion for her began to cool. He was a man who needed constant adoration, and Anne was not a submissive wife. She was intelligent, outspoken, and often argued with him. As she failed to produce a son, Henry's eye began to wander. He started to take an interest in one of her ladies in waiting, a quiet, gentle woman named Jane Seymour. Anne's position was becoming increasingly dangerous. She had powerful enemies at court who had supported Catherine of Aragon and who saw Anne as a heretic. Her sharp tongue and political influence had won her few friends. In 1536, the end came with shocking speed. Then Henry wanted to get rid of Anne and marry Jane Seymour. An annulment would be difficult and would make their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. So a more permanent solution was found. Anne was arrested on charges of treason. The accusations were outrageous. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. She was also accused of plotting the king's death. There was no real evidence to support these charges. They were almost certainly fabricated by her enemies with the king's approval. She was put on trial and inevitably found guilty. The men accused with her were also condemned. She was taken to the Tower of London to await her execution. She had been queen for just 3 years. In her final days, she showed remarkable courage and dignity. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green. As a small act of mercy, Henry had hired a skilled swordsman from France to ensure the end would be quick. Her husband, the man who had torn his kingdom apart to marry her, had her destroyed on trumped-up charges because she had failed to give him a son and he had found a new woman. Her story is the ultimate example of a woman who was raised to the highest peak of power by a king's desire, only to be thrown into the abyss when that desire faded.